When most people think about medieval soldiers, they picture swords, shields, and heavy armor. But real campaign life was much harsher, more practical, and sometimes a lot stranger than that. Medieval soldiers in Europe carried far more than just weapons, because staying alive on campaign meant dealing with hunger, cold, repairs, marching, and sudden combat at any moment. These are 15 things medieval soldiers actually carried on campaign, and some of them are a lot more surprising than you might expect. Number 1. The spear. Across medieval Europe, the spear was one of the most common things a soldier took on campaign, and that should not surprise anyone who looks at how armies actually worked. A spear was useful in more than one situation, and its widespread use makes practical sense once you look at how medieval armies actually operated. A mounted knight could carry a lance, while a man on foot might use a thrusting spear or a heavier pole weapon, but the basic point stayed the same. A long shaft gave reach, and reach mattered before an enemy ever got close enough for a sword fight. It let soldiers strike first, hold a line, threaten horses, and create space in the chaos of a push between bodies. That is one reason medieval sources and surviving evidence keep bringing us back to spears again and again. Popular culture often makes the sword look like the center of medieval war, but in the field, a spear was usually the more practical answer. It also fit the broader realities of campaigning. Medieval armies had to equip many men, not just a few famous fighters, so a straightforward, effective long weapon made obvious practical sense. Once you start from that reality, the whole image of a medieval army changes. It stops looking like a line of duelists and starts looking like a crowd of men who needed tools that worked under pressure, in mud, on uneven ground, and in tight formations. A spear also had a psychological effect. Even before contact, a wall of points forced an enemy to judge distance, timing, and nerve. And once that spear line broke up and the distance disappeared, the next thing on the body began to matter more. Number 2. The sword. The sword was absolutely present on campaign, but usually not in the romantic way modern audiences imagine. For many soldiers, especially better-equipped men, it often worked as a sidearm rather than the first thing used in every clash. A medieval sword was valuable because it was compact, fast to draw, and versatile at close range. A knightly sword with a straight, double-edged blade and cross-shaped hilt stayed remarkably consistent for centuries, which tells you something important. The design worked. It could cut, thrust, threaten gaps in armor, and still remain light enough to wear at the hip all day. The pommel was not there only for decoration either. It helped balance the blade, making the weapon quicker and more controllable in the hand. That balance mattered when a fight became crowded, and there was no room left for broad, heroic swings. In other words, the sword was not just a symbol of status, even though it definitely carried status. It was a practical backup when formations collapsed, when a spear was lost, or when a soldier suddenly found himself fighting at arm's length. It also traveled well. A man could wear it while marching, entering camp, guarding baggage, or moving through a town. That portability is one reason swords remained so important, even in periods when battlefield killing power often depended more on other weapons. So, yes, medieval soldiers carried swords. But the real story is more grounded than legend. The sword was admired, sometimes expensive, and tied to rank, yet on campaign it was also simply the thing you wanted hanging at your side when every longer weapon became awkward.
It was the weapon that stayed with you when you dismounted, when a formation broke, or when a sudden fight started before there was time to organize properly. That constant readiness is a big part of why the sword kept its place. Number 3. The shield. Before plate armor became dominant for the wealthiest fighters, the shield was one of the most useful pieces of protection a soldier could carry into campaign life. In earlier medieval Europe, shields were commonly made of wood and covered with leather, and they came in shapes that changed over time. Round and oval shields were familiar in earlier centuries, and later the triangular kite style and other forms became common, especially among mounted warriors. That shape was not just aesthetic. It offered broad body coverage, which was especially useful for mounted combat. Shields also did more than stop blows. They created confidence. A soldier behind a shield could hold position longer, absorb the first shock of arrows or thrown weapons, and survive the messy first seconds of contact. By the high Middle Ages, shields were often painted or marked, so they also helped identify individuals and groups in a world where color and symbols mattered. Even when armor improved, a shield still remained useful in many contexts because real war was full of imperfect protection, exhausted men, and sudden danger from angles a helmet or mail shirt could not solve on its own. A shield could also be battered, scraped, split, and still be worth carrying, because partial protection was better than none. That practical logic matters. Medieval soldiers did not carry equipment because it looked impressive in a manuscript. They carried what bought them a little more time, a little more safety, and a better chance of staying on their feet. Once you understand that, a shield stops looking like a prop and starts looking like survival strapped to the arm. It also shows how defensive gear shaped behavior.
A man protected by a shield could close distance differently, brace differently, and stay in the fight a little longer than a man with nothing but nerve. Number 4. The helmet. A helmet may sound obvious, but it is one of the clearest reminders that medieval soldiers understood exactly where a human body was most vulnerable. A blow to the head could end a fight instantly, whether it came from a sword, a mace, a fall, flying debris, or even the rough crush of men and horses in motion. That is why helmets were so widely used across different periods of medieval Europe, though their exact forms changed a lot over time. Earlier warriors often used segmented or conical designs, and later centuries saw helmets develop into bassinets and more enclosed forms as armor evolved. What matters is not only the changing shape, but the constant idea behind it. Protect the head first. A helmet did not make a man invincible, and it could be hot, heavy, uncomfortable, and limiting to sight or hearing. Soldiers wore one anyway because the alternative was worse. Even men who were not covered in the best body armor often tried to secure decent head protection. In campaign conditions, that made even more sense because risk did not exist only in a formal battle. Raids, ambushes, skirmishes, falling from a horse, and sudden camp alarms all made the head especially vulnerable. A helmet was the kind of thing a man hoped he would not need in the next minute, but he kept it close because if that minute came, nothing else could replace it. In practical terms, it was one of the few items that could turn a fatal hit into a survivable one. And that leads directly to the next layer, because once the head was covered, the rest of the body still needed a serious answer. Number 5. The mail shirt. For much of the medieval period, one of the most important pieces of military equipment a soldier or knight could carry was the mail shirt, often called a hauberk in some contexts.
It was made from linked iron rings and worn over the body as flexible armor. To modernize, mail can look almost modest compared with later plate, but that impression is misleading. Mail represented serious work, serious value, and serious protection. It could help against cuts, reduce the danger of many blows, and cover large areas of the body while still allowing movement. Medieval evidence shows just how central it was. In earlier and high medieval Europe, body armor was often basically a mail shirt, sometimes paired with additional protection like mail leggings or later layered defenses. That meant a soldier on campaign was not just wearing a battle costume. He was carrying around a heavy investment in survival every hour of the day. Mail also had an important advantage: flexibility. A man could ride, walk, mount a ladder, or handle gear without the stiffness of later full plate. Of course, it had limits. It was not a perfect answer to every threat, and it still demanded something underneath it to make wearing it bearable and more effective. But for centuries, it was central, because it offered a workable balance of coverage and movement. In campaign life, that balance mattered almost as much as protection itself. Armor that saved you in battle, but left you unable to march, mount, breathe, or function for long periods, was a problem. Mail endured because, for a long time, it was one of the best compromises medieval warfare had. It was also a reminder that good equipment was wealth in physical form. When a man wore mail, he was carrying labor, metal, money, and military status, all woven together, ring by ring. Number 6. The layer under and over the armor. One thing modern viewers often miss is that armor was not just armor. A medieval soldier also carried the clothing and support layers that made armor wearable. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a man-at-arms might wear a long tunic or surcoat over his mail, and in later centuries, armor was increasingly attached to sturdy garments beneath it by points or laces. That means campaign equipment included not just metal, but the textile system around the metal. This mattered for comfort, organization, and function. A layer under armor helped manage rubbing, weight, and the way separate pieces sat on the body. A layer over armor could help with weather, identity, and practical wear. None of this sounds glamorous, but it is essential. Real soldiers did not simply step into metal and turn into statues. They had to walk in it, ride in it, sleep near it, and maintain it over time. The garments tied to armor are part of that reality. They remind us that warfare depended on cloth as well as iron. They also remind us that the line between ordinary clothing and military gear was often thinner than movies suggest. In many periods, a fighting man's appearance outside his helmet was not completely separate from broader dress culture. The battlefield version of him was still built from familiar garments, just adapted for war. So when we talk about what a soldier carried on campaign, the answer is not only weapons and armor plates. It also includes the less dramatic layers that made the whole military outfit possible to wear for days and weeks instead of minutes. Without those layers, armor rubbed worse, sat worse, and worked worse. The metal gets the attention, but the cloth made the metal usable. Number 7. The dagger, or everyday knife. Not every useful blade on campaign was a sword. Daggers and smaller knives were everywhere in medieval Europe, and museum evidence makes that very clear. They were military sidearms, but they were also everyday tools. A small blade could cut cord, slice food, work leather, trim wood, open packages, and deal with dozens of small tasks that came with travel and camp life.
That is why blades of this kind were worn by people across social levels, not only elite warriors. In some cases, a small knife was part of normal dress. In other words, a medieval soldier did not need a special, dramatic reason to have one. He needed one because daily life kept demanding it. On campaign, that usefulness multiplied. Big weapons are good for fighting, but they are awkward for everything else. A dagger or utility knife filled the gap between war and ordinary survival. It was close at hand, easy to carry in a sheath, and small enough not to become a burden. The military role was real too. When combat became extremely close, or when a larger weapon was gone, a dagger mattered. But that is only half the story. The more surprising fact is how normal such a blade was. It lived in the same space as eating, repairing, cutting, and traveling. That overlap is a huge part of understanding medieval soldiers properly. Campaign gear was not divided into neat modern categories. The same object could be a tool at noon and a weapon a few minutes later. Number 8. The belt purse. Campaigning was expensive, messy, and full of movement, so soldiers needed a secure way to carry money and small valuables. That is where the belt purse comes in. Medieval purses were common objects for both men and women, and by the later Middle Ages, many were designed to attach directly to the belt. For a soldier, that made obvious sense. Coin had to stay on the body, not disappear into a wagon that might get lost, looted, delayed, or seized. A purse could hold pay, personal money, a seal, small tokens, maybe a scrap of wax, or any little object a man did not want loose in his clothing. This detail matters because it pushes back against the fantasy that armies lived only by grand charges and battlefield honor. Armies also ran on supply, payment, and constant small transactions. Men needed ways to handle food, drink, repairs, lodging, and other necessities whenever circumstances allowed.
Even soldiers serving a lord still lived in a world where coin mattered. A purse was therefore not a luxury accessory. It was part of functioning in the economy of war. The really interesting part is how ordinary it seems. When you picture a medieval campaign, you might imagine shields and banners first, but hanging from a belt, there was often something far more familiar: a pouch for money. That is one of the best examples of how campaign life was both distant from us and strangely recognizable at the same time. It also hints at something broader. Medieval soldiers were not detached from everyday exchange. They moved through markets, settlements, and supply networks, and a small pouch at the waist connected them to all of it. That tiny object carried a very large truth. War moved through money almost as constantly as it moved through steel. Number 9. The leather case or small personal container. Alongside a purse, some medieval people carried structured leather cases for specific items, and those cases appear in inventories and surviving objects. These were not fantasy treasure boxes. They were practical travel containers. A small leather case could be attached to the costume and used to hold personal possessions such as cutlery, writing tools, or other compact essentials. For a soldier on campaign, that kind of organized storage made a lot of sense. The road was hard on loose belongings. Anything small could be lost in straw, mud, baggage, or darkness. A proper case turned scattered objects into equipment. This matters because medieval campaigns involved a surprising amount of small, easy-to-misplace gear. A man might need a spoon, a knife, a sewing item, a token, a letter, or some little piece of metalwork, and all of it had to travel somehow. The existence of these cases tells us that people were thinking in very practical terms about portability. They were not only carrying weapons, they were managing kits. That may sound modern, but it is exactly what long-distance movement forces people to do in any century. Once you start noticing containers, straps, loops, and belt attachments, medieval soldiers become much easier to understand. They stop being silhouettes in armor and start looking like travelers whose lives depended on keeping small, useful things from vanishing. Number 10. Fire-making gear. One of the least glamorous but most essential things a soldier could carry was a way to make fire. Surviving fire steels from early medieval contexts are a simple reminder of a larger truth. Campaign life depended on controlled flame. Fire meant cooked food, warmth, light, drying wet gear, heating water, and basic camp survival. Without it, even well-armed men were miserable and vulnerable. This is where historical reality becomes very different from the simplified, battle-only version of the Middle Ages. An army on the move spent far more time marching, waiting, camping, and enduring weather than actually fighting. In that world, the ability to start a fire was not a small convenience. It was a daily requirement. Of course, not every individual soldier needed to strike every fire himself every day, since men moved in groups. But the gear absolutely belonged in the wider material world of campaigning, and carrying the tools to make flame made obvious sense. Fire-making equipment is also a good reminder that armies were communities of labor as much as engines of combat. Men had to eat, mend, warm themselves, and stay functional night after night. The march did not end when the swords were sheathed. In some ways, the harder part started after dark, when staying warm and fed became just as important as being armed. A fire tool is therefore one of those objects that seems small until you imagine a wet, cold evening with no shelter prepared and no easy way to cook what little food you have. Number 11. A whetstone.
A blade that could not hold an edge was a problem, and medieval people knew it. Surviving whetstones are a quiet but important piece of evidence because they point to the constant maintenance behind military life. Weapons were not magical objects that stayed sharp on their own. Knives dulled, swords suffered wear, and everyday cutting tools lost usefulness quickly with repeated work. A small whetstone solved part of that problem. Some examples were even pierced so they could be suspended or carried more easily, which says a lot about portability. On campaign, a sharpening tool was valuable because there was no clean separation between combat equipment and daily tools. The knife used for food, repair, or camp chores also needed an edge. So did any weapon that a soldier expected to trust in an emergency. What makes the whetstone interesting is that it represents discipline rather than drama. It belongs to the world of preparation, not spectacle. A soldier carrying one was preparing for repeated use, repeated wear, and repeated inconvenience. That is a very realistic image of medieval war. Men did not simply carry weapons. They carried the means to keep those weapons useful. In practical terms, a whetstone is one of the most honest objects in the entire campaign kit, because it tells you that everything wore down and someone had to deal with it. It also tells you that military efficiency was built from small routines, not just from courage in the moment of contact. Number 12. Eating gear. Campaigns were not fought by men who floated above ordinary needs. Soldiers had to eat and drink constantly, and that meant some kind of portable eating kit mattered. Surviving objects from the medieval world include spoons, bowls, and even fitted leather cases designed to carry utensils. One late medieval spoon in the British Museum even unscrews into pieces so it could fit into a case more easily, which is the kind of detail that makes medieval travel feel unexpectedly practical. There are also surviving wooden drinking or eating vessels that had cases or suspension loops for carrying. None of this means every soldier had the exact same set, but it does show that portable tableware was a real part of life on the move. That matters because eating in a camp was not a polished, courtly scene. It was a repetitive necessity, often done in rough conditions, and a man with his own spoon, knife, or bowl was better prepared than one who had to improvise every meal. Once again, the surprise is not that medieval soldiers had weapons. Of course they did. The surprise is how much campaign life depended on small personal gear that made daily routines possible. A spoon is not heroic, but after a day on the road it may have felt more important than a banner. A personal eating kit also reduced dependence on whatever happened to be available in the moment, and that kind of reliability mattered when an army was tired, hungry, and moving again at first light. Number 13. A repair tool like an awl. This is one of the most overlooked items in the whole subject. Campaign life destroyed things. Leather straps cracked, clothing tore, baggage loosened, scabbards failed, tent material wore out, and all the little connections holding equipment together were under constant stress. An awl, basically a pointed tool for piercing leather or other material, belonged to the world of repair. Surviving medieval examples show that such tools were present in everyday working life, and that matters for soldiers too. An army was full of objects that depended on holes, stitching, lacing, fastening, and patching. Even if not every soldier personally carried and used one every day, repair tools were part of the mobile support world that kept men functioning. This becomes especially important when you stop imagining campaigns as brief cinematic events and start seeing them as long periods of movement. Things break on the road. They break in rain.
They break when packed badly, stepped on, dragged, soaked, dried, and reused. A simple, pointed tool is therefore more revealing than it first looks. It tells us that medieval war required ongoing maintenance at the smallest level. The army did not just move weapons. It moved a whole, fragile, material culture that constantly needed attention. And once repairs became necessary, small tools often mattered more than impressive ones, because they kept the straps, sheaths, and fastenings alive for another day. Number 14. Food rations. Medieval soldiers did not march on courage. They marched on food, and one of the most basic campaign realities was carrying something to eat. Historians of logistics emphasize how central bread was to pre-modern armies, and when fresh bread was hard to supply, harder, denser, biscuit-like forms had real value because they kept longer and traveled more easily. Other staples, such as meat, fish, beer, or wine, also appear in the broader supply picture. But the key idea is simple. An army needed calories in portable form. That meant soldiers and the systems feeding them were always concerned with transport, storage, spoilage, and access. This is one reason campaigning was so demanding. Weapons could be forged once and carried for a long time, but food had to be replaced constantly. A soldier might receive provisions, buy them, gather them, or move with stores depending on time and place, but in every case, the material fact stayed the same. No food, no army. And unlike the elegant image of a noble feast, campaign food was about durability and practicality. Men needed something that could survive movement and still be eaten quickly under pressure. That is why something as plain as bread or hard biscuit belongs on this list just as much as any famous weapon does. In real warfare, logistics was never background. It was the condition that made everything else possible. The glamorous image of medieval war usually focuses on armor and impact. But armies more often slowed down, turned back, or fell apart because supply became harder than fighting. In that sense, a sack of bread or a ration of hard biscuit was not a minor detail in the story of war. It was one of the reasons an army could still exist a week later. Number 15. A badge, token, or small religious object. One of the most human things medieval soldiers could carry on campaign was not strictly military at all. It was a devotional object, a pilgrim badge, a token linked to a saint or shrine, a small relic container, or some other visible sign of religious life. Medieval Europe was full of such objects. Pilgrim badges were widely produced and worn,
often pinned to clothing or displayed in a visible way. They could serve as proof of pilgrimage, signs of devotion, souvenirs, or objects believed to carry spiritual value. For a soldier facing uncertainty, that mattered. Campaign life was dangerous, tiring, and unpredictable. So it makes perfect sense that many men would carry something tied to faith, hope, identity, or protection. This should not be treated as a decorative side note. In the medieval world, religion was woven into ordinary action, travel, memory, and fear. A soldier did not enter campaign life as a purely military machine. He brought his beliefs with him, often in physical form. That is why one of the most revealing things a medieval soldier might have on his person was a small, cheap badge made of lead alloy rather than a prestigious weapon. It shows how close the practical and the spiritual could be. On the same body, a man might wear iron for defense, steel for fighting, leather for storage, and a tiny devotional object for reassurance or status, all at once. That mix is one of the clearest signs that medieval campaign life was not only about combat. It was also about carrying the things that helped a person function, endure, and make sense of danger.
A devotional badge could be cheap, light, and materially simple, but to the person wearing it, it could matter just as much as a far more expensive piece of gear. A badge like that could stay with a soldier through the march just as easily as a knife or purse.